With so many different purpose-built productivity tools on the market, Roam might seem like an unlikely candidate to use for productivity. But I'm here to tell you, over the last couple of years, I have grown to absolutely love using Roam for productivity. I'm a bit of a productivity nerd. Over the last 15 years of my career or so, I have experimented with a ton of different productivity apps and frameworks. And Roam has really today become the mainstay or the spine of my productivity system. Over these last couple of years, I have developed what I call the Outliner productivity method. As the name implies, this productivity framework really leverages Roam's unique abilities as an outliner. And I also think that this productivity use case happens to represent an excellent entry point for the real use cases that we're going to explore in this course. So we're going to jump in first. Before we do that, before we start diving in and actually building out our productivity method here in Roam, I did want to spend this lesson talking a little bit about some of the theory, some of the high-level benefits of using Roam for productivity. And we'll come back and touch on these throughout the rest of this section. So number one, it puts the ritual first. And this one I think is really important. I put this in the number one spot very deliberately. I think for many of us, when we think about productivity, the natural inclination is to think about the different tools out there on the market. And I have found, again, over 15 years of tinkering and experimenting with a lot of different tools, that if you don't have a ritual in place, a standard sort of process for coming back through and reviewing and keeping things up to date and just generally kind of cleaning house in your productivity system, then any of those tools is going to eventually fall short. So having a ritual in place for your productivity, I think, is the absolute bedrock of any effective productivity system. And this Outliner productivity method really puts the ritual first. It anchors around what I call the weekly review, which we'll get to again a little bit later in this section. Number two, drives clear prioritization. In a sense, this is a sub point of the bullet point there up top, but I thought that it warranted its own point here. And the main idea that I want to drive home here is that through this Outliner productivity method, and specifically through that weekly review process, what I'm really aiming to do is separate the decision-making process. So the idea of picking what to work on and when to work on it, I want to do as much of that as I can during the weekly review process, so that for the rest of the week, I can really just focus 100% of my energy, frankly, on getting shit done. I think many of us underestimate the amount of cognitive overload and cognitive capacity that is absorbed through the process of decision making. So as much as we can batch process those decisions and get those made early in the week and then hit the ground running for the rest of the week, I think the better. And this method really, again, lends itself very well to that. The third point here I want to make is the idea of fostering next step thinking. This is an idea that some of you may be familiar with. I generally stole this idea from the Getting Things Done framework, which is a framework that I have been a big fan of. I don't necessarily consider myself a GTD practitioner, but there are a few ideas in that framework that I think are timeless, and I have sort of repurposed here. And I think this idea of really breaking complex projects down into very concrete, very specific, and typically very small next steps is hugely important for boosting your productivity. And again, this method, I think, lends itself very well to that as well. Another idea here taken from the world of Getting Things Done is the idea of low friction, quick capture, or the inbox, as it's known in Getting Things Done. You'll see as we work through this framework that I have an inbox implemented that I think is one of the more underappreciated ideas in productivity. This idea of having a place where we can just very quickly capture things with minimal or zero friction as these things fly at us through the course of a busy week, and then trust ourselves to come back and process those later. So we'll talk about that a bit more as well. One other point I wanted to make here is the idea of kind of Goldilocks flexibility. So just the right mix of constraints and flexibility. I've found that many dedicated or purpose-built productivity apps on the market work really great until they don't. And what I mean by that is they kind of force all of your different tasks or items that you're thinking about to fit within a standard framework by definition. And in many cases, that's okay. And in fact, Roam, this Outliner productivity method, you'll see I'm using templates, what are called Roam templates, to enforce those sort of constraints or standards, because there's no point in reinventing the wheel for every task that you're entering. But sometimes what I've found, especially in the world of modern knowledge work where many of us are engaged, is you come across a task or a project that just doesn't quite fit the mold. And Roam allows you to be very flexible and track those things as the specifics of that project or task necessitate. Let me move myself out of the way here for the final point, which is the idea of historical logging. This one is a bit of a tangential benefit in my mind, not a huge deal, candidly, but something that I have found pretty nice in a couple of edge cases is the idea of going back and being able to see a historical log of the things that you've been working on. You can see a project-based history. You can also get a view of like a time-based or week-based. Hey, what did I spend the last month of my time working on? And we're going to use Rome's linked references to illustrate this. And it has actually become, again, a very nice feature for me in cases where maybe I'm starting up a new project that's kind of similar to one that I finished recently. This allows me to go back and take a look at the historicals of that previous project and kind of get a sense for what I might be up against moving forward. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into the next lesson.